Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Michael La Ronn. Hey, Michael, how are you doing?
Hi, Matty. Good to see you again.
It is good to see you too. And at this point, I would normally introduce you to the listeners and viewers, but you've been on the podcast so much, I feel certain everybody knows you. And so I invited you to think of one fact that you could share about yourself that the listeners would not know.
One fact that, okay, so I am adventurous, but sometimes in the wrong ways. And it always works out for me somehow. So I was recently in Wisconsin, and for some reason I wanted to eat some seafood. And it's not technically landlocked, the area I was, but you know, there's a lake, but you really count that as seafood.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna go to a seafood restaurant. So I went to the nearest seafood restaurant I could find, and it was a Cajun gumbo restaurant, which sounds perfectly cool. So I walk into the restaurant, and it's like a Chinese restaurant, but like they converted it into gumbo, like Cajun food, but like the people still owned it. So it was like half of the menu was Chinese food, and the other half of the menu was Cajun food. And at that point, I should have been like, I'm out of here. But I was like, you know what? No, they have got crawfish, they've got shrimp. I got to do this. And they even brought like the seafood to you in like a bag. Like that's how, it was actually delicious. Like, I'm not just saying that, it was really good. And I told my wife about it after the fact, and she's like, why did you do that? I was like, well, why not? She's like, that's not authentic Cajun. I was like, yeah, no, it wasn't.
But
It was
tasted good.
definitely an authentic experience. So, I tend to do that a lot, and it doesn't always work out for me, but yeah, it ended up being great. So I am the kind of person that takes a lot of risks. So that just is an example of some of the risks I take on a daily basis. And yeah, I guess enjoy it.
My Wisconsin restaurant experience was going, and I used to live in Wisconsin. I've lived in several places in Wisconsin when I was very young, but I was in Wisconsin on business, and we went somewhere, and I got a clamato, and
Yeah.
so I asked what it was, and the woman kept saying what was in it, and it was like a noisy restaurant, and I couldn't hear her, and so I said, okay, that sounds fine. So they brought it, and I was tasting it. I was like, that's really unusual. And so they finally conveyed to me that it was clam juice, which was fine. But evidently the person who had taken me to the restaurant was so mortified that I was drinking clam juice without being aware of it that he made the waitress take it away. Bring something else. I was like, no, I'm fine. Actually, I just was curious what was in it.
Yeah.
So
I mean, you got to be adventurous. You got
that's
to
right.
try stuff and, meet new people and get yourself exposed to new experiences. And,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to throw your preconceived notions out the door, and you can have a really interesting life. And that's just always the code that I've lived by. So that's maybe a fact that I've never shared publicly.
Yeah. Well, I think our goal will be to find a way to tie in Wisconsin Cajun, Asian food, and clamato with the conversation that we're having. And
Okay.
if we can do
Challenge
that, we get
accepted.
extra credit. So we had
It'd
talked.
be awesome.
We've had like this sort of series of two perspectives on where we pick a topic and you and I share two perspectives on it. We've been collecting topics that might lend itself to that sort of thing. And there were two separate topics. One was rebranding, which would be one perspective on because I don't have a lot of experience with rebranding. And the other one was making the choice between writing and marketing. And I thought it would be fun to combine them. So what we're going to be talking about is we're first going to be talking about your recent rebranding effort. And then we're going to talk about what made you decide to invest your time in that effort rather than in writing. What were the considerations that you were weighing when you were deciding to allocate your time that way? So let's just start out. Can you describe what your recent rebranding effort was all about?
Yeah. So I'll preface it with saying that when you write a book, you own a piece of property. And it sounds strange to say, but owning a book is like owning a home. And when you own a home, things start breaking after a while. I mean, even when you have a new home, things go wrong, and you still got to maintain it. And you've got to have service people come over every now and again and keep things running. And it's the same thing with a book. So I've been doing this since 2014, and I've got over 90 books at this point. And things go stale. Covers go stale. Something that was in vogue in 2014 just doesn't cut the mustard in 2023. And sometimes you have to reevaluate your pricing. Sometimes there's interior things like formatting. If I formatted some of my early books in Microsoft Word, that needed to be redone. So anyway, that's just a long preamble to say that when I publish a book, I don't think that I'm done with it. I know from an expectation standpoint that I'm going to have to come back to it within at least 3 to 5 years to, one, look at it, and then two, figure out, okay, is there something that I could do to put a fresh coat of paint on this? And so I have a series. It's called the Indy Author Confidential Series, and it's a quarterly series where I publish a book every quarter, and I talk about what I'm doing to be successful as a writer. So I've always been of the opinion of, well, maybe I'll be super successful one day. At least that's what I hope. That's what I'm working toward. And wouldn't it be really cool to leave like documentation of how I did it in the moment, as opposed to getting super successful and then writing a book about it and then having to remember. I just think it's more practical to see someone's evolution over the years as opposed to just one volume. So, and it's just fun for me because I can write down what I'm learning and it helps me learn it a little bit better. And that's really the real reason for me. I just like to write down what I'm doing and document my journey. And so I identified, so this series is like, I think I'm at volume 13 now. So it's a lot of volumes. And I was starting to find that when I was designing the covers or working with my cover designer, that all of the covers kind of had a sameness to them. Volume 1 looked great, but then when I got to volume 8, oh wait, I'm using a color that was very similar to volume 1. And so when you look at all the books at a portfolio level, they didn't really look right. Something just didn't seem right. So I got the idea to, okay, let me sit down and figure out, from a color perspective, how, like if someone wanted to buy all of these books and they wanted to put it on their bookshelf, what would it look like? Like how could I improve the collector's value or just make them a little bit more visually appealing so that every quarter I could have a consistent and new looking cover. So anyway, I work with my designer and we came up with a color scheme that's based on the Pantone color of the year. You know that, where every year they come out with a new color.
Yep.
So the first volume of the year is the Pantone color of the year, essentially. And then it goes from we did some sort of calculation where it's the color of the year, but then like you take like a color palette and you run it through one of the color palette engines. And so then it gives you like 4 different colors based on that color. I forget the name of it, but the name of the color patterns. But so then the second volume and the third volume and the fourth volume are based on that. And then I have a compilation volume at the end of the year that pulls all of the yearly or the quarterly volumes into one. And then that is a different color, but it's a little bit darker than the Pantone color. So if you have all of the individual volumes, they're a lot brighter and more colorful. And if you have the annual volumes, they're a little bit darker and a little bit thicker.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so to me, that was the fresh coat of paint, to give you a long story on what it was. But that was the fresh coat of paint that I put on the series just to make it a little bit more marketable and just, I think, a little bit more visually appealing. And also, I can give really clear instructions to my cover designer because he knows exactly what color we should be using, for each
And you're
quarter.
both waiting anxiously to find out what the Pantone color for the next year is.
Exactly, which is kind of fun, right? So
that is really fun.
Like I said, yeah. So it's just it's something I had to do to kind of keep myself entertained over the summer. It was a big project. I mean, rebranding 13 books. And then there were other little things that I needed to change as well in the interior. So like, for example, updating my copyright page with like an AI training clause. And made sure I need to do that. There were some other little things that I did with the interior, just that I started doing with future books that I hadn't had a chance to do with these yet. So it was a lot of little things that kind of added up. It wasn't just the covers, but it was covers plus interior. And then also with the KDP print updates on the pricing, with the royalty structure and things like that. It was also an opportunity to take a look at the pricing. Are my paperbacks priced right? Does this make sense? Am I losing money on any of these paperbacks? Do I need to raise the price on any of them? I've got a few books in AI audio. Does that pricing make sense? Right. So it was really just a comprehensive look at everything, just like a homeowner would look at the home and say, all right, what can we do to make sure that everything keeps running properly?
Did you do any other work on the actual content, like checking for things that were out of date? I'm thinking of this because I just referenced taking the short tack, and in there, there's a reference to SFWA, which when we wrote the book was the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, which I now think is Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. But I thought, ooh, I have to put that on my tickler list of something to fix. Did you look at the
Yeah, that's
content beyond the things like the copyright page at all?
not a lot because most of my content is pretty evergreen, at least
Mm.
in this series, it is. I do talk about like some tools and apps and different websites and things that I'm using, but I've tried to stay away from that a little bit just because of that reason you talked about. But I also like to think about this series as like it's like a monument in time, right? So it's what did I learn when I learned it? And if the tool's no longer there, that's fine. It's not so much about the making sure that the references are up to date as it is. Here's what I did to learn, and here's the steps that I followed, and here's what I got from it. And whether the tool is out of date or not, or the name has changed, you could still read it and get the same value from it.
Yeah. It's interesting that you folded the reassessment of the price in there because um, I sort of more or less formally reassess my prices, let's say once a year. And it's mainly print book based on what the cost of the production of the print is. Um, it- was there any consideration for your pricing decisions beyond just making sure that the increased cost of paper wasn't eating into your profit? Like, were you using the pricing as a positioning tool as well as just, updating it from a sort of maintenance point of view?
Kind of. I think about pricing. So we have different approaches to pricing. It's really interesting. So, but I think what's kind of ironic about it is that we kind of come to the same conclusions in terms of how to price. So when I'm thinking about price, I'm really just thinking about the reader on Amazon or Kobo or at a bookstore. Does this make sense compared to everything else that they have the option of buying? Right. And when I think about pricing, I think about the whole portfolio. So when you have as many books as I don't think about things so much at the book level as I do about the portfolio. So I'm willing to take some hits on books here and there because of the portfolio. Because if I can get a reader into my ecosystem, then they'll buy all of my books, right? And so what does that look like? How does it make sense? So that's really the only thing I'm thinking about. When I had a chance to take a look at the pricing for this series, I was looking at a couple of things. The first thing was internationally, do the prices make sense given the exchange rates and the weakening dollar over the past decade? And also, are there any markets where maybe I'm a little bit overpriced? It, would a reader, does it make sense? Is what I'm doing in Mexico make sense? Does what I'm doing in England make sense? That sort of thing. And then also correcting any mistakes that I maybe made. Because I don't know about you, but when I go in and add prices to my books, it's not impossible to make a mistake, to actually accidentally add another nine or, put the decimal in the wrong spot. I think
Well,
we've
I
all
do
done
notice
that
one
at
of the
some point.
platforms that shall remain nameless is you always have to put the
Yeah.
price in and then back up and type it in again, because if you type in 4.99, it always shows up as 40.99. So that's a
Yeah.
little tip.
Yeah.
Everybody double check the numbers after you
Yeah.
tab
Just
out of
double
the.
check the numbers.
Yeah.
And it's always a good opportunity. I mean, anytime you're going back and reviewing your books and republishing things, it's always a good idea to do that. Just to look at it because we're human. Things happen. And so um, but yeah, another thing I had to do as a part of this, and it's not really related to the pricing, but I also had to some of the earlier titles had the store bought ISBNs. So until relatively recently, I was not purchasing my own ISBNs. And so that was also a problem because as you think about the whole series as a portfolio, well, readers aren't going to be able to get volumes 1 through 7 if they wanted to go to a bookstore, right? But if they could get volumes 9 through 12, well, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So I had to republish, I had to unpublish some of the earlier titles and then republish them with my proper ISBN. And that was a project too.
Yeah, that
'Cause then I
sounds
had
like it
to
would be more of a project
unpublish.
than everything else combined.
That was a pain in the neck.
Yeah.
Because I had to unpublish the original title, had to make sure it got unpublished. Then I had to publish the new version, and then, there's just other considerations that go along with that. Like some of the earlier titles weren't on Ingram Spark. So I had to get formats for that. So it was also an opportunity to look for gaps in the series so that my ultimate goal is to make it so that readers anywhere in the world can buy any of my books, and
So
so filling in gaps is critical.
how much of your time did you spend making a targeted assessment of the conventions and needs of the different countries? So, as an example, I know that in the UK, book prices often end in 4.9, where in the US and other countries they would end in 9.9. And so I always make sure that my UK prices end in 4.9 because I sell enough in the UK to make it worthwhile. But after I get past like my top 4 or 5 countries or markets that I'm selling into, I'm really not doing anything other than at some point I came up with some multiplier that said, okay, if I'm ever going to price it for Mexico, then I'm just going to multiply the US price by such and round it to the nearest
Mhm.
9.9. But did you do a more thorough investigation into what would be appealing in each market?
Yeah, a few years ago, I spent probably the better part of a month doing research on each individual currency and trying to figure out what the best price point would potentially be. And I wouldn't recommend other people do this. I'll just give you the Cliff Notes and I'll save you a month's worth of work.
Eh,
No one is consistent. No one is consistent. Traditional publishers, we all know they price their stuff way too high. In some markets, they price their stuff ridiculously high. And a lot of indie authors are just letting the retailers calculate the, the exchange rates and stuff for them. And also, there are some very either. You might see book one and it's, £2.99. I think that's how you say it, right? And then you see book one, it's like £4.99. And then book two is £2.99. And then book three, it's just not consistent
yeah.
across each thing. And so I didn't find really anybody that had, a consistent strategy. So I just took it upon myself to say, okay, what do I think is too high for this market? What do I think is too low? And I have a pretty good connection network of authors that are all over the world. I mean, I have a YouTube channel and I was able to put some feelers out for my friends that live in different parts of the country or different parts of the world, I should say. And I was able to just come up with, okay, here is my strategy for Mexico. Here is my strategy for India. Here is my strategy for Germany and continental Europe. And just based on what people told me. And it's all anecdotal, right? But what I did is
Mhm.
I put everything together in a spreadsheet. So every time I publish a book, I have a spreadsheet that I pull up and I have, the price of the book in US dollars. And then whatever that price is, I have all of the corresponding prices in all of the international currencies. So it's just basically a matrix where if
Yeah,
the
that's
book is
great.
$4.99, I can, okay, what do I need to price it in Norway? And so I've got about 10 to 15 markets that I shouldn't say I care about, but that I'm more focused on.
Yeah.
And then everything else, I just let the retailers convert it. Um, but yeah, there's some currencies where I just never sell a single book. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to pay attention to those. But there are some where I do. I've got, probably a top 10 list of readerships around the world in different countries. And so I want to make sure that the pricing in those countries makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I have sort of, I think the more skinny down version of that, which is things like all for ebooks, always match the price in Australia and New Zealand. Always have Canada be $1 more than the US. Always
Mhm.
have the UK version be the same number, but with a 49. So if something's selling for 4.99 in the US, it would be 4.49
Right.
in the UK and things like that. But I'm doing it for maybe the top 5. But yeah, it does keep it from having that weird effect on the other side of an automatic conversion. And I even see some of the promotional sites specify that you need to have the price optimized for a market in the sense of having it end in 99 or end in 49, depending on what the convention is there, because they probably don't like advertising books that are,
Yeah.
217 or something like that.
Yeah, or $20 and or it ends up being kinda crazy.
Yeah.
And the wrench in this is the exchange rates.
Yeah.
So, I actually did an exercise as part of this where I mapped out so I everybody has access to all of the payment reports from Amazon, for example. It's just one place. And I say Amazon, and I'm singling them out because they are the only retailer that does not do the exchange rate conversion for you on the royalty reports, which is really frustrating. I don't know why they don't do that. But I was able to get on Amazon all of my payment reports, and I was able to, from today all the way back to 2014, I was able to calculate or able to grab the exchange rates for each Amazon store market. And I was able to chart them just to figure out, is the euro getting stronger against the dollar or is it getting weaker? And in almost every circumstance, with the exception of maybe one or two different currencies, the dollar was definitely weakening, right? And so
Mhm.
a $4.99 royalty today is not what it was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So in some cases, in particular with this series, I did raise some prices because it just didn't make sense to continue getting what I'm getting. But I also recognize that as indie authors, our books are fairly cheap, and that's an advantage that we have. And so, the reason we have such crazy inflation is because everybody's raising their rates or
Mhm.
everybody's raising their prices. So you don't want to contribute to that problem, but in some cases, it does make sense to raise the price.
Yeah. Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? Please consider supporting it and all the work I do at the Indie Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/the Indie Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindieauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. When you were talking about the cover design, um, how much, if any, consideration did you give to the fact that people who were collecting the series, um, would have a different visual experience on their shelf, after the rebranding? Like, do you expect that some readers are gonna go back and purchase the earlier ones so they have kind of the encyclopedic effect of all the books on the shelf? Or were you just figuring that, that was just a price that had to be paid, that there would be a difference in the books? Like, were the sizes the same, or did that
Yeah,
change?
everything was the same. Everything was the same with the exception of the color.
Okay.
Even the icons on the front. I mean, all of the books follow the similar pattern
Mhm.
where that I've got it's a two-dimensional flat icon of something, and there's a door opening, like there's a secret, you know. And it's sometimes one volume it'll be a coffee cup, another volume it'll be a dollar sign or a typewriter, but it all has the same branding. I just changed the colors.
Yeah.
So from someone who has existing volumes, it actually wouldn't look all that different. You probably wouldn't even notice.
Yeah.
It would still look decent on the shelf. It just the future volumes would be a little bit brighter color wise.
Yeah. Very interesting. Are there any other things in your checklist of rebranding that we haven't hit? We've talked about in some interior stuff and covers and pricing. Any other things that we haven't hit?
No, I think that's pretty much it. This was a nonfiction series. Naturally, this isn't the first time I've rebranded. I've rebranded a lot of my series over the years, particularly with fiction. And with the cover, I talked about colors and things like that. But with fiction, you really want to take an opportunity to ask yourself, is this cover working? Like, is it a signpost of the genre that I am saying that it is. Because I've had series where I completely missed the boat on the genre. I thought I was doing urban fantasy, or I thought I was doing space opera, or game RPG, game lit, but I wasn't at all. And so that's another opportunity to really look at what the market's doing, especially if it's been a few years since you've published the book, to be able to look at different reports like K-Lytics by Alex Newton and other reports out there on how the market is performing, to figure out, are there any new trends I could take advantage of? Maybe, in urban fantasy, for example, about 10 years ago, the thing to put on your cover was usually a female with her back slightly to the reader, maybe in a leather jacket. You can't quite see her face. Like, that was kind of the thing. But now that trend is different, right? You generally see people's full faces. There's usually action poses. There's usually lots of magical flourishes, things like that. So if you look at urban fantasy covers that are selling today compared to what was selling 5 or 6 years ago, it's totally different. So going back to my homeowner's analogy, sometimes you've got to put that fresh coat of paint on. But before you do that, you have to really look at what competitors, I shouldn't say competitors because we're not competitors, but you have to
Yeah.
look at what other authors are doing.
Right. You have to make sure termites haven't gotten into the wood underneath the paint that you're covering up.
Exactly. And you got to make sure you got the right color paint. That's the thing too. Make sure that
Yeah.
when it dries, it's the color you want it to be.
Well, I
To
love the
torture the
Pantone thing
analogy even
because
further.
by definition, you're picking a color that's appropriate for that era. Did you find, if you're advising someone who has fiction series or nonfiction series, do you think that it's a rebranding consideration should happen more frequently for one of those than the other?
No, not really. I think it's the same. I think nonfiction, it's easy to think that you don't need to rebrand it, and maybe you don't. Maybe you don't want to.
Mhm.
That's okay too. But covers get stale.
Yeah.
There's no way around it, and so it would behoove you I think personally every 3 to 5 years
Mhm.
to look at your covers. Then don't touch it.
Right.
But if you've got a book and you look at your sales data and it was doing really well for the first few years, and sales have kind of petered off a little bit, well, maybe getting a new cover might help you.
Yeah.
Might help re-energize and get it introduced to a new pool of people.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think regardless of whether you write fiction or nonfiction, taking a portfolio mindset and a maintenance mindset, it can't hurt you.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine doing that. I've been fiddling with my Ankeneer covers for a while, but I'm taking a break from the Ankeneer books. I have 6 of those now. I'm switching to my other fiction series, and I can imagine that when I go back, which probably won't be for a couple of years, that might be a good time. I might, like, look at that more, not starting completely from scratch, but, well, kind of starting completely from scratch from a cover point of view, just
Yeah.
assessing whether that would be a good idea or not.
Well, one of the things that I did with my early covers one of the things that I didn't do with my early covers that I'm doing with my later covers is I have my name at the top in as big of a font as my cover designer will let me get away with for my fiction.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because I think about my series as a portfolio. And
Mhm.
not my series, but my entire books as a portfolio. So someone picks up book one in a series and they read to all the way to the end of that series and they love it. And they say, I want to know where I could find more. Then they the next time they're on Amazon or somewhere and they come across one of my books, they'll know me by my name. It'll be a
Yep.
big name. They'll be able to see it.
Yep.
You know? And with my nonfiction, I don't do that as much. I usually put my name at the bottom of the covers because those readers they're searching for something different. They're searching for a solution to a problem. And if they like you, they'll buy your whole series, but you have to lead with the problem
Right.
as opposed to leading with your name. And so it's a little bit different, but with fiction, which is what I imagine most people are listening to this are into, I I didn't do that at the very beginning of my career. Some series I would have my name at the top, some series I'd have my name at the bottom. They'd be in different fonts, and that makes it really hard for readers to pick up the name recognition. And so
Yep.
over the years, as I have been rebranding my series, I have been adopting that strategy so that everything I have looks fresh and new and also consistent from the portfolio perspective.
Yep. So we've gone through a really good sort of case study of a rebranding. And now I want to get to the second part of the conversation, which is How did you go about deciding that the time you had um, available to you for your writing and publishing business, you were going to allocate to rebranding rather than more writing?
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's so when I became a writer, I was a writer. I was focused on writing as many books as I could. And once I got over about 20 books, I realized I can't do that anymore. I continued to write like a beast because that's what I love to do. But I also had to say, wait a minute, I have to step back and I have to manage these books that I've published. I mean, yeah, I've got a lot of books and I'm proud of them and it's great. But if I think about my books as a portfolio, is this serving what I'm trying to move toward? And so when I think about my time spend for the year, I think about what I want to produce and write, which is critically important because you wouldn't have a career if you didn't do that. But I've been spending a lot more time over the past 5 years really thinking about my portfolio and filling in, like I said, and I can't say it enough, filling in gaps in my portfolio and making sure that everything is consistent and that it does what I want it to do. And so when I think about my time allocation, it's in some respects more important to me to have a cohesive portfolio than it is to pump out 10 to 12 books a year. I would rather publish 5 to 7 books a year or 5 to 8 books a year and then also do some work on my portfolio to make sure that everything looks good and, fix issues with formatting and things like that pop up. And there's always new standards and things that you have to adhere to. It's just progress of technology. I devote some of my time to that because I find that it just makes everything a lot easier to manage in the long run, as opposed to doing it, in one big burst down the road. But I'm
Yeah.
a bit of a unique creature in that regard. But I just think that once you get over a certain number of books, your perspective has to change.
Well, I thought it was very interesting, and I'm coming at this from the point of view of I'll just focus on my fiction. So 9 novels now, and a fraction of the number you have. But there's part of me that also says that after 10 years, so this December will be the 10th anniversary of when I published my first novel. And
Awesome.
yeah, which is kind of
Congrats.
exciting. Um, and my mantra the whole time has been, the creation of new content always has to take precedence. It certainly has to take precedence over things like social media, but taking precedence even over some of the more intrinsic core functions of publishing. And as I was thinking about this topic, I started thinking, maybe not. I mean, 9 books is a lot. 9 novels is a lot. Not maybe in comparison to the highest producers in the author world, but in the scheme of things, it's a lot of books. And I started thinking, would it be reasonable with 9 books to say, you know what, I'm just going to take a year off and I'm going to focus on making sure as many people know about these books. First of all, making them as good as they can be, recovering them, improving formatting, whatever that might look like, all the things that you mentioned. And I'm just going to focus on getting these out into the world. So if we think of it in terms of the Alliance of Independent Authors, I've done the editing. I'm improving the design, the production, distribution, marketing, promotion, and selective rights licensing. Do you think that there's a number of books where it makes sense for an author to say, I'm just going to step back and instead of focusing on content creation, I'm going to be focusing on these other things?
No, I don't think so. And I don't want it to seem like I'm contradicting myself based on what I just said. But when I think about portfolio management, I'm not thinking I'm going to stop writing and just manage my portfolio. To me, it's yes and. Yes, I need to write. And yes, I need to also manage the books that I've written. When I think about the allocation between like writing and marketing or selective rights licensing, for example, I think it can be a very dangerous thing to take time off of your books. And that's just my personal opinion. I have a friend and he finished a book and he said, I was so happy I finished this book. I decided I needed to just take a break. And I took a deep breath, and that breath lasted for like 2 years.
Yeah.
So, if you don't write, then you will blink, and then you will just won't believe how much time has passed you by. So I think that it's a good idea to strike a compromise. And to me, that compromise really should be you have a minimum level of productivity. So if you do 2 books a year, maybe you do one and a half, or something like that, or you write a bunch of short stories or something, but it just makes it really easy to get comfortable not writing. And
Yeah.
I just caution people against that. And again, that's my personal opinion, but I think you should stay productive. But does your time allocation have to change? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it makes it doubly difficult for me because I work full time. So I really have to be strategic about my resources, and taking the time to rebrand this series, like I just talked about, took a decent chunk out of my word counts, but it
Yeah.
was worth it because of the vision. I know where I want to go, but yeah, got to be careful. I wouldn't
Y-
recommend stop writing though.
Yeah. I can imagine maybe the middle path would be to adjust what the goal of your writing is. So I think that, for the last 10 years, the goal of my writing has been to produce another book that I could put out. But
Right.
if I decided, I'm not suggesting I'm going to do this, I'm just playing with different scenarios. If I decided I wanted to spend the next year and it was totally to get my publishing house in order, I'll put it that way. And that anything I wrote was going to be like, I was definitely going to write for X number of hours or X number of minutes a day, but I was not necessarily going to write like assigning myself a publication schedule, or not even necessarily writing something that I knew was going to be the next in a, maybe was never going to see the light of day. But I
Right.
totally agree that that idea of keeping the writing muscle loose and exercised is super
Yeah,
important.
it is. And you don't have to get your house in order all in the same day. You can do that as you go. And I actually wrote a book. It's called Keep Your Book Selling. And it's about that very thing. It's about getting your house in order and creating, like, one of the things that I do is I have it's called a master publishing file. I picked this tip up from ML Buckman in one of his books. And it's basically a glorified Excel spreadsheet that has all of the metadata for all of my books. So instead of going to Amazon and figuring out what my price is, or going to Amazon to figure out, whatever metadata I need to know, I have all of that in one central location. So I can filter and sort, and I can see what formats each book is in, side by side and that sort of thing. And it sounds silly that you would say that, but when you have as many books as I do, I sometimes I don't remember what books are available in which format. I mean, they're all
Yeah.
available in ebook and paper, but I don't always know, well, hey, did I do hardcovers on that? I don't remember if I did or not. So, like, to me, that's part of getting the house in order too, in addition to the marketing
Mhm.
and making sure your ads are on point, and the time it takes to build ads and monitor them and make sure that they're working, right? I mean, that's a lot, but you don't have to do all that overnight. You can come up with a plan and say, these are the things I want to do to get my house in order. Here's how much time it's going to take approximately per week, and then, piecemeal it.
Yeah. I
And
think I
if that keeps you productive, then that's,
yeah.
I think, a better way to do it.
I see a possible next conversation for us is two perspectives on keeping your publishing house in order. Although I think in this one, our perspectives would not be that different. I think we would be pretty aligned in that conversation.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. But yeah, you are a spreadsheet person. You like to keep everything organized, and I am too. And that would be a fun conversation.
Well, it was just recently. There was a spreadsheet that I put together. Like I have the equivalent of what you're describing with like I have all my ISBNs and all the publication dates and blah 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 blah, all the links
Yep.
to all the different books on the different
Retailers.
retailers and so on. But the one thing I didn't have that I realized I needed when I got an assistant is a book that would say um, just each of the books and then the formats. Because, for example, I had at the time I put this together, I had audiobooks for uh, all of my novels except the most recent one. And so when my assistant started doing something related to audiobooks, she was confused about what she was supposed to do with most recent one. It's like, oh, that's because that hasn't come out yet. But just indicating, like, is there audio? And if there's audio, is it human narrated or is it AI narrated? And
Right. Is it
yeah,
exclusive to ACX or not exclusive to
yeah,
ACX? I
yeah,
mean, when you really dig into the metadata, you find that there's a lot that you can and should be tracking
yeah,
for each of your books. And the best part about it is that once you get your house in order, you only have to get it in order once.
yeah,
Then you got to
exactly.
maintain it. And it's a lot easier to maintain something that's in order, and that's why that's important to me personally.
Yeah. Well, the whole conversation, I've been trying to figure out a way to work in balancing of the Cajun food with the Asian food in terms of allocating time. I haven't come up with anything. How about you?
Well, we were talking about rebranding. I almost had a window to talk about the Cajun restaurant, rebranding from Chinese to Cajun and splitting the
Yes.
difference between the two. So
Yes,
maybe that could
exactly.
work. That could work. And
It would be interesting. You should go back and find out if they've made the full transition to Cajun or if they're like hanging on to their legacy
oh no, they're
cuisine.
they're they're totally hanging on to their legacy, and I loved every minute of it because you walk in and it's like Chinese music playing, like over the loudspeakers, and like when you sit down at the tables, it's like gingham cloths.
Oh
They
my
they
goodness.
bring they bring you so it's 100% deliberate. And that's why it was such a cool experience. I've never been to a place like that. And so that's kind of what you want to create when you're a writer. You want to create an authentic experience that readers will say, "Hey, this was kind of different. It wasn't quite what I expected." It hit the spot though, and that's what
Yeah.
makes them buy your next book.
If you're bucking the tropes by serving both gumbo and mugu gai pan, then there's going to be some niche audience out there who's going to love it.
Exactly. And you might think that they don't like clam juice, but maybe
No,
clam juice is exactly what they needed.
with that thought, Michael, as always, it is always lovely to talk to you. And just in case anybody doesn't know, please let them know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Yes. So I do have a book that people can check out if you're interested. It's called Keep Your Books Selling. It's about how to get that house in order. If you're interested in that, you can find that at authorlevelup.com/books, along with all the other books that I've got going on. And you can see the rebrand of my series. The series is called Indy Author Confidential. And you can get that at authorlevelup.com/confidential. Don't tell
Right.
anybody.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks, Maddie. Take care.